And Colin. There we go. All right. I'm glad. Thank you for telling me that. And Brian made it, so he's here.
All right. Just let me know when we want to get started or if we want to wait on a few other of the committee members.
Was anybody else having the same issue I was on the link not being there? I guess, do we need to resend it out at all?
Yeah, I'm resending it right now. I was trying to get people's videos on.
Thank you.
Okay, I just resent that to everyone. Brian, what's your pleasure? Do you want Chris to get started or do you want to wait a few more minutes?
Yeah, I say let's go ahead and get started.
Okay. All right. And I do, so Matt and I are probably going to tag team this meeting. I have a bit of a conflict around 8-ish our time, 7-ish your time. So if I drop off, Matt will be taking notes on the discussion to the extent it carries over. So I'll try and get through the presentation as quick as I can, but as usual, please stop me at any point if you have questions or want to get into anything a little bit further, because we're prepared to go as long as we need to this evening. But this is the second major installment of the substantive changes, and most of these focus on sustainability or general community design. This was coming from actually our most recent technical committee meeting. So it was just September 9th when we finished up discussions at the staff and technical level. And as you can see here, this touches on many of the articles, obviously, or chapters, I'm sorry, many of the chapters. Some we've already discussed and some we're yet to discuss, but tonight it's these main 3 that you've been given, really 2, 6 and 8, and 10 is just, we will be rolling over the current standards and trying to reformat and integrate as need be. So tonight's mainly about non-residential development and design. So the M, MUB, and I zoning districts, and then landscape design. That was the kind of the missing piece from last meeting that, you know, I kept referencing that some of this is in the landscape section. So this kind of rounds out how all the design articles are at least supposed to integrate and where we're making substantive changes. So I'm going to walk through 6 and 8 just to our overview and general approach. So overview, key changes. really on the development capacity, what people can do as far as building volume, we don't have too many substantive changes. We're keeping all of the current zoning district development standards. So in other words, height, setback, building coverage, those types of things are staying the same. And those are all incorporated into a table as they are now. The one unique thing about the current district is the M districts, that medical, mixed use medical area, their heights are based on a height map, not the districts themselves. And so that is being maintained as well. One of the changes we've made in the development standards, a subtle change, was what we call the build to range. It was 0 to 10 in some districts and 0 to 5 in others. I can't recall which one was which, but we decided to try and make that all the same. And then through staff discussions, we also decided, since the draft you've seen, to change that to 5 to 15 feet. And what that build to range is it's at both a setback and a maximum setback. So the current table says 0 to 10 or 0 to 5, depending on which district you're in. And our interpretation of that means your building has to be located within that distance. So that becomes key to a lot of our other discussions that we'll go through tonight. So that's the way that works, but it's not really a change. That's the way we're interpreting that it works now, and staff kind of confirmed that. The other change within that table is we are converting that most of these districts do not have a lot coverage standard, but they do have a landscape, required landscape area that's based on a percentage of the lot. And so we're kind of merging those ideas and saying within these districts, we want usable open space. So there is an open space requirement, and that will come into play and it's comparable to the required landscape area, but what we count towards that might be subtly different than what you do now under it being a required landscape area where it's supposed to be landscaped. These are fairly urban districts, and so active gathering spaces and hardscapes and things like that we want to count, and I'll go into that in a minute as well. And then the last thing is, because we are separating non-residential and residential, we have this issue that we sort of haven't really resolved in our own minds between staff and ourselves of what the best approach is, but there's the idea of what about residential only projects in these districts or mixed use buildings in these districts. So right now we have that placeholder that says those projects use the MUR3B standards, which this committee has yet to see because that's our last installment. But our assessment is that's the most urban and highest density district of the mixed use residential districts. And so it will be appropriate to roll those into these non-residential districts as well. And we're looking for what's the easiest way to do that. Is it better to do it by cross-reference? Is it better to merge them all back the way you currently have it and not keep them separated? So we'll figure out the most user-friendly approach, but substantively, that's what we want to accomplish. The next major bullet point down is where we have our most significant changes, and that's what we're calling a comprehensive design strategy. You'll see in a moment that all of the things we have in here regarding design are regulated in some fashion or another in all of the districts. They're just not regulated in each of the districts. So some districts might have something on required transparency or a required building line, and others don't. And interestingly, the MUB districts, the one where you're trying to get the most mixed use and pedestrian oriented, don't really have many design standards at all, but there are a few of them that we're carrying over. But we want to take an approach that's more comprehensive, but that's also simplified. So those first three things are what we're focusing on: frontages, buildings, and open space. If we regulate those three things well, then we can start to do different types of strategies for those districts based on their context. So for example, if you're on a really pedestrian oriented street, you might have different standards than you are if you're on a more traffic oriented street. And I'll go through that in a moment. And then to round out that idea was we're trying to get objective standards for all of those things, even though they're design related topics. It's hard to be objective on design related topics, but we want to start with a baseline that's something that's easily measurable. And then with the strategies and techniques behind them, come up with options on how to achieve that. And then the last part that would round out that flexibility is we've been integrating that idea of administrative adjustments into all of the standards, particularly when we're dealing with design standards. And then lastly, we'll cover sustainable site and building guidelines that we've included in this chapter as well. So overall, I mentioned our comprehensive design approach. It's based on this simple idea. And if you haven't or aren't familiar with this book, I would recommend it. It kind of changed the way I looked at planning and cities and design and codes. Honestly, I started thinking like this is really quite simple. Why do we have so many challenges and problems? And these 3 rules are what this author, David Sucher, thought makes good, walkable, pedestrian-oriented places. And it's true. And so that's where our frontages, building design and open space came from. Incidentally, on number 3, the prohibit parking in front, he takes a strong position on that because he's aiming for the most walkable places. You'll see we've come up with a strategy that lets us be lenient in some cases, but strict in other cases. But this is the main idea that permeates through all of these, and it kind of influences a lot of the way we think about urban design, particularly in non-residential areas. So I mentioned earlier that all of the things we're talking about are things that are currently in the code in some fashion or another. And so you see those listed on the left. They were most prominent in the M districts. There was required building lines that were, and what I mean by that is your building has to be occupying the frontage of the lot for a certain percentage of it. And so that in the M districts, that was 75%, and it applied everywhere. But it didn't apply in the MUB districts. And so our thought was, well, it's important there too. But there also might be reasons for granting relief to that. And entering the MUB standards here did have some suggestions for when you would consider alternatives and things that would define the edge of the property along the streetscape, but didn't necessarily have to be the building. So we've got some more specifics on that idea. The other area where a lot of these design standards came from was there's a section of the code that applies only to large retail buildings. And so, and those were written in a way that you could tell they were geared towards large retail buildings. So the standards were a little bit, I would say, not generally applicable, but the ideas they were trying to implement certainly were. That idea of breaking up larger blank walls, relating buildings to spaces, and creating some variation and interest on walls, especially on more pedestrian-oriented areas, or things we wanted to carry over. There was also things about entryways and creating connections to spaces, and so we carried that over. And essentially what we did was we just grouped them into those 3 topics I mentioned: frontage types and design standards, which addresses these issues here that are all currently regulated. So front building line, where the building sits; required extent of the front building line, how much of the lot needs to be occupied by a building frontage; and then the rest is access, width, and parking extent. Where can car-oriented parts of the site be? And that encompasses everything we want to talk about with regard to non-residential frontages. Then with the building design itself, it deals with massing and blank walls. How do you break up that volume? I mentioned earlier, the tables are starting with the same building volumes you have. We didn't necessarily hear any issues that those needed to be adjusted, so we're carrying those over. But how you use up that volume can create buildings that are a little more friendly to adjacencies and streetscapes and things like that. And then moving on down, some of the more street-oriented issues with transparency. Again, some districts had it, others didn't. And then materials and details, that was mainly in the large commercial buildings. So that's one we're kind of working with of, are we sure we're being flexible enough? So those of you that have looked at that section in detail and are interested in that issue, we certainly appreciate your feedback, if not tonight, over the coming weeks on that, because we want to make sure that's always a sticky issue of regulating, and we want to make sure we're being really flexible, and we want to make sure we're meeting the intent so that people have options to do good things. I think there's a lot of misguided material standards that we don't want that to be the case in this code. And then the last part I mentioned was open space types and design. So we are looking at it a little bit differently, so that one, connecting with those civic and social spaces that we talked about under chapter 3, the larger scale subdivision standards, where if you have some common or public areas nearby, perhaps those count towards a requirement. But then also creating gathering spaces within your project. So things like plazas, courtyards, even on building things like balconies and decks and things that are active social spaces that we want to contribute to the open space requirement. And then streetscape and frontages. So I'll cover that in relation to the landscape standards as well that are in chapter 8. And then I mentioned building related amenities, those balconies and courtyards and things like that. But then also the buffering and screening should count as well. The current code with required landscape areas just seems to think that open space should be about landscape and those types of things, but we want it to be more about active urban spaces as well. So moving into the substance of each of those. So with frontage design, we've come up with, this is an approach we take often to take those ideas from David Sucher's book of, build to the street. Yes, that's awesome. Do it. It makes great urban villages, but not every street in a well-planned area or even a really functional area. You need your messy streets, right? You need streets that aren't serving those, or you have uses that are support uses that can't possibly meet those standards. So we kind of relax them. And so this idea of A through D frontages, we didn't have a better name yet, but Matt and I want to come up with better names if we need to. We want them to be kind of embraced by your context, but the idea is more pedestrian oriented to the left, A and B, more car oriented to the right, C and D. But there might be some terminology that resonates that we could name these if this concept sticks. But essentially, we're regulating 5 main things: the front building line, so that's where the building sits in proximity to the lot. And again, right now in all of these districts, it's either 0 to 5 or 0 to 10. And we're considering converting that to 5 to 15. And I'll explain that in a moment. Required front building line, how much of the lot needs to be occupied by that. So the idea of in these urban areas and in mixed use areas, we want to be framing streetscapes to the extent we can, or to the extent we aren't, we want to know that we're in a context where that's appropriate as well. So the C and Ds. And then that gets to access, width and spacing, and then parking location. The idea of hide, minimize the parking, move it to the back of these buildings is a good thing for walkable areas. But we know you have car-oriented areas, and you have some examples where you've done a really good job of what you do with the frontage when there is parking along it. So these are things that are already happening in the community, even though there aren't necessarily standards for it, as you can see by the representative pictures there. And then the last part of frontage is the streetscape. So what we did was, and again, this table has changed, but it all starts with this front building line, which is, again, the current standards from the development and dimension table, except we started to relax them a bit for frontage B and C. So it was okay for the buildings to be set back a little bit further. And then in the frontage D, it could be set back completely, and it could be more of a parking oriented site. Currently that isn't evident in the standards, and I think a couple of your projects might have gone through a PUD zoning because of that. And then there just wasn't good guidance on where you could and should do that. One of the things in some preliminary staff discussions was we wanted to convert this to a 5 to 15, because oftentimes we're dealing with streetscapes that might be a bit incomplete. And so the idea of moving the building back has some advantages, because you can gain some of that space to complete the streetscape. And so that plays into what we also want to count as open space. So in the instance where a building does that, they should get credit for that as their open space requirement, completing the streetscape. So we have a provision in the code that does that. So extending the sidewalk, creating some type of plaza or seating, creating street trees and landscape on streets where there isn't enough room as an extension of the streetscape would be a very positive thing. And so that 5 feet will give us the range to do that. And then in cases where the street already is complete in terms of what the code would require from chapter 3 and more complete streets design, the alternative, the administrative adjustments could allow it to go up to 0. So that idea is not in the version you all saw. That kind of evolved with some staff discussions over the last couple of weeks when we went through this. So the second row down begins to say, what's the required building line? How much of that frontage do you need to occupy with the building? This A, 75%, it comes from the current standard in the M districts is, I believe it's either 70 or 75, but there's that idea of we want most of the lot to be covered by building frontage in these mixed use and urban areas. So then we just sort of looking at, we actually did a sort of a windshield survey down Broadway and looked at some sites to come up with these ranges, but the idea that not everyone has the perfect urban building, and you could see it as a standard being relaxed in some cases. The other key point about this provision is what we count for the required front building line. I mentioned that the MUB district currently has a provision that says certain things can count. We think that should be true in all districts. So for example, if someone builds outdoor seating with a street wall along it, those should be acceptable for a non-building frontage as well, that still counts towards your required minimum percentage. So we have some examples of that we'll show you as well. I think the next two are sort of self-explanatory. It's mainly just trying to limit the car influence on sites, the car and influence particularly adjacent to the streetscapes through access and parking location and parking setback. We're going to cover these with Public Works. These standards really come from the current limit on access width generally is 30 feet, and it just says that generically throughout the entire development code. And so we began to scale that towards, you know, whether you're more pedestrian oriented or car oriented. And this roughly reflects a lot of the measurements we took on some of your key blocks that reflect these different types. But we also these aren't really traffic oriented standards. So we want to make sure we're not saying that these are solving traffic issues. They aren't necessarily, although they probably could and should work, but these are mainly urban design standards, how to protect the streetscape, limit curb cuts, things like that, and keep a pedestrian oriented environment where it needs to be. So I'll pause there, I guess. Any questions on the elements of the frontage design?
Chris, this is Matt. Just one item maybe to clarify. Would the frontages be mapped and specified in a
really
guiding
good
document?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we did talk about that at staff level too. And so I have a couple thoughts on that. And that leads into this bottom part of the table where how it applies. So they could be, although they aren't, and they won't be with this code effort. It would be a little bit of a difficult task to do that. And you'd want to do it based on some thinking about long range analysis and development potential. However, the development code and the procedures have a specific plan process. So one that the city's currently going through or attempting to go through for the downtown area. When this code gets in place, it would be very easy to use that plan to go map these frontages and forever answer that question on certain blocks. So based on how the development's going to be organized, you can very specifically coordinate the frontage types with the street types. And we would think that would be a very good way in the specific plans to go through and do that. And so we're trying to set up the code that eventually the city could start doing several specific plans for different areas based on this approach. Until we get there, what we did was we set up what we think are default standards. So in MU, and we think this is at least as good, or if not a better decision-making process than you currently have. Because remember, there currently is a build to range. It just it's not exactly clear when or where you would relax it. And in the M district, it's high, and in the other districts, it's sort of unknown of how much the required building line is. So this top part is that more comprehensive approach that we mentioned. The going across the rows is the more flexible approach. So what we started with was the default in the MUB and MB1 and 2, your more mixed use retail commercial districts ought to be frontage A. But we know that B and C are perfectly acceptable in certain contexts. So staff could use administrative adjustments to grant projects those opportunities, and the criteria and the administrative adjustments would help analyze that. So it would be more context based. And then before you got to frontage D, in our original version, we have conditional use permits, but all that was signaling is something that gets an elevated review to planning commission. In our preliminary discussions with staff, that kind of was the wrong term because it's not really a use issue, it's a design issue. So that idea of the administrative adjustments that can't be approved by staff, or that staff bumps up to the next level, that would be what a frontage D standard would be. What we think that's kind of solving is, I mentioned earlier that I suspect a couple of the projects that are PUDs may have done that, probably not just because of this frontage question, but the Chick-fil-A is an example. It doesn't have a street front building on any portion of the site. It's surrounded by a drive-through, but it has an excellent street wall and landscape wall. And partly because that was a PUD, it didn't have to go by these standards, so it answered those questions. We think there's an opportunity to not have to force it into a PUD, but if you meet the right criteria, that could be done through a discretionary review that we would replace this section, not with conditional use permit, but some type of elevated exception process or special exception process for the design requirements that would require at least a planning commission review or council review. And then tracking down, we just get a little more relaxed in the mixed use medical districts because they're not as heavily commercial. And so a lesser standard might be acceptable in all cases. And then for industrial, the most relaxed, all of them being applicable because we're not shooting for pedestrian oriented environments, and it's more of a functional need in those districts if you're doing industrial uses. So that's the approach and the idea to the applicability. But back to your original question, Matt, they certainly could be mapped, and we think it'd be a great idea and a great tool to map them based on future planning efforts.
Okay, and Michelle has a question.
Yes, specifically with regards to the access spacing, instead of one per block max, could there be any consideration that it might be, instead of per block, like one for every, I don't know, I'm thinking of some of the smaller properties, the more along Old Hampton or even Broadway, that if they've been redeveloped, oftentimes, especially if you're in frontage A, the parking's behind the rear of the building, you're going to need access for cars to get there. And that maybe there's not a parking lot that stretches between all of those properties in the back. So is there a way to sort of make that a little bit more flexible? And then, of course, the width of it, depending on what the tenants are. My background is commercial retail.
Mm-hmm.
And so property management. So I'm always thinking about retail and stuff like that. But the access width, some of that also depends on what type of tenants are there. Of course, we have to plan for every kind of tenant, but to get some semis through there for delivery, I just want to know if there's some flexibility with the width and the spacing.
Yes, I think there's flexibility in two regards. One, these aren't necessarily set in stone yet, so we're continuing to look at whether this is the right approach or not. And two, I think in any case where we ran into a situation where it just doesn't work and the right solution is different than one per block or the 20 feet, that administrative adjustment process should be able to give some relief to that standard. However, frontage A is clearly meant for, this is intended for the alley loaded blocks. So the primary access should be the alley. If in the event that frontage A, and again, there's plenty of MUBs that aren't alley loaded, so we get that. So that's where B and C perhaps are allowed, or an option where you do frontage A with an administrative adjustment to whether it's one per block or that width would certainly be possible. We want to get this standard as close as we can to correct. And I think for the alley loaded blocks with mainly street front buildings, this seems to be correct, and that the truck access is done by another way, not through that. This is kind of picturing that laneway that goes up between buildings and maybe is shared by a number of lots on the block to get to that alley or to get to that internal block access. But
yeah, both the customers and like the loading and the trash and all that stuff come up and down the alley is what you're
correct. Yeah, and again, one of the things on frontage A is, if you recall our streetscapes, we'll probably have guidance in here that, this is only on streets with generous on-street parking. You wouldn't put frontage A on a street with no parking. That wouldn't make sense because the parking is key to this, and so having street parking is what makes frontage A work.
Okay, and then not to open up a gigantic can of worms, but when you talk about the administration or administrative, flexibility, how are you going to describe that in the code?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So two places. So if you recall back in chapter 2 in the procedures, we have this section that we're referring to well, it's not on this table, but in the text, it refers to section 16.2-10, which will actually be moved to 11 based on recent amendments. But there's a section that has specific criteria on how to do administrative adjustments. It guides the decision to look at the context, look at what we're trying to achieve from the design objectives, and render a decision based on that. The other thing is in each section where we allow them, there are criteria specific to that. So for the frontages specifically, this 16.6.4 has the criteria for how to consider an adjustment to the frontage standard. So our hope is those criteria, along with the design objectives. Well, actually, I have a slide on this. So let me just advance ahead a little bit. All right, I did. Let me see. I skipped it. I might have moved it out. I'm sorry for the jumping around here.
Well, like I said, I didn't want to open a giant can of worms.
So this is the idea. So we in chapter 2. No, this isn't a can of worms. This is actually crucial to this approach. So it's a great question. In chapter 2, we have the process for administrative adjustments. When it applies, what are the review criteria? And it's a staff procedure unless it deviates from a certain degree from the standards, then it is no longer a staff decision. But other than that, the staff should be capable of making some of these flexibility decisions. We start at the standard because that's objective and measurable.
Right.
Each of these sections has intent and design objectives. What are we trying to achieve? What's our outcome? They may have context applicability. So that A, B, C, and D of the frontages, you could look and decide which one to apply. And then to the extent you're still not meeting the standard, there's design strategies following each of these that gives you options. And then lastly, if you can't do it, there's an administrative adjustment that swings you all the way back to, we only grant these if you're still meeting our intent and design objectives. So that kind of circular process is trying to get us, the certainty of the standards here that are objective and measurable, but the flexibility of trying to meet different objectives with different techniques is the idea.
Right, because we're an infill city. I mean, so we've
Correct.
got all sorts of different sizes, and those sizes, I mean, they're not going to get smaller for the most part. They're going to get bigger if they change at all. But there is a lot of different things to plan for. So, okay, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
And so, Chris and Michelle, this is Brooke Bell. And I just wanted to add in that, we're talking a lot about administrative adjustments, which is great. But you guys are the Planning and Zoning Commission, but we also have the Board of Adjustment and Appeals.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And pretty much almost anything can go other than a use question to the Board of Adjustment and Appeals in terms of an appeal to a staff decision or a variance to some sort of dimensional requirement. And so that's always available. And, as staff, we hear, potential requests that we say, well, you may not meet the criteria, but you're welcome to apply. And then we hear other cases where, yeah, you've got a really good case and you're welcome to apply. And they can apply either way, regardless of what staff thinks. But beyond these tables, many of the stuff we're going over tonight can be appealed, but more importantly, just requested a variance from the Board of Adjustment and Appeals. And those are typically hinge on unique physical conditions. So yes, in our infill city, we have tons of unique physical conditions. And so it's very appropriate to take those to the Board of Adjustment and Appeals. And I just want to throw that into the mix.
Well, thank you. And after the last couple of planning and zoning meetings, those people on Board of Adjustment and Appeals do a hard job.
Yes, and they follow the criteria, which is very specific.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we are working on, even through our staff discussions, the idea of some of the intent and design objectives being less looking, we're going to take a finer tooth comb back to those to make sure they're pretty concrete, because we want those to be, although they're not regulatory, they do explain how we want these standards to apply. And they also explain when the standards aren't working and something else works better, we want to consider that as well. I'll move on to the building design part. So that was all about building placement in the frontage, and then this is more of the design elements. The idea here is simply the closer to the street your building is placed, and that would be determined by those frontages we just mentioned, the more human scale details we want on it. So blank wall limits, front entry features, the transparency on first and upper stories, and then materials. And again, all of there's current standards in the code for these. They're just not universally applied in all districts. So this concept is reflected in this table. The first one, massing and modulation. When do we want the walls to be broken up? The current standard that's in there is from the large retail buildings, and that's starting at 75 feet that it would be broken up. But that also requires the building to be offset. In other words, you have to actually physically change the mass of the building and step it back. I think 3 feet is the requirement. And so what we simply did was we created 3 thresholds based on how close to the street you are: smaller scale closer to the street, larger scale farther from the street, but then also gave different strategies and techniques to break up the building. So it wouldn't always be the case that you have to change the volume. You can do it through other things, whether it's architectural features, whether it's things like balconies or voids in the buildings that you see in some mixed use buildings. So there's a number of things that can be done to break up the massing and modulation. But at least this idea started from the current standard of 75 feet for those large scale retail buildings. Entry features and spacing, I think the current standard in there is just 1 per building. Looking at buildings closer to the street, you often see them even more frequent than this, but the idea is we want more activity on those streets when there's buildings closer to them, and less so when it's set back. And the transparency requirement is just in the M districts. It is, I believe, staff, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, and Brooke, I thought it was in the A range for all of the M districts. But we may have adjusted how you measure this slightly, but the idea was this similarly, it becomes lesser important the further you get back. So the idea was, let's start with a lesser percentage when the building's further back, and let's start with a lesser percentage and then also only count it within 50 feet of the entry the further back you are. And so I think these features are sort of seen in other buildings, and I can jump to those slides in a moment that show this principle with the building designs. Hold on, I'm sorry. The last section is the material one. As I mentioned, that's this just refers to a table where we listed all the current material standards from the large commercial retail buildings. We also added in a few that we think are appropriate, and then we also specified more of how primary and secondary materials could and should be used. So we're not sure we're on the target for that. So I would encourage some of you all to take a look at that, especially if you've from reviewing projects as planning commissioners or looking at projects or knowing your development community and the things you want to see, that this is the one area where I'm the least comfortable with where we're at. However, it is based on things that are in your current code. Let's put it that way. I want to jump ahead a minute and apologize again for jumping. I have some of these out of order. I want to kind of explain that a little bit further so that you can see that some of those principles on this. So obviously frontage A, there's frequent entrances, lots of ground floor transparency, lesser upper floor transparency. And then the buildings are broken up in more rhythms here through things that aren't, this is one big mass, but it's broken up through pillars here and some details on the facade that are massing things that break it up, and all even contemporary buildings use the same strategies. So it's broken up in smaller increments. A frontage B, this one reflects that example of, although people may not recognize this as the most beautiful architecture and aesthetic building, it's a great urban site and building. It has a parking lot to the side. Most of the frontage is occupied by activity, although very little of it is building frontage. But this is an example of that open and civic space that could count, particularly when they created a street wall here, and then the parking is minimized. So this one's hitting that at that 50% to 75% of active spaces on the frontage. A frontage C, another, if I could mix my metaphors, another A+ on the C frontage, a car oriented site with not much building frontage along it, except over here it does. And then the building does all the right things when it's on the frontage. When it's not building frontage, the site's doing all the right things with regard to landscape and low screening. This is really an excellent job of a more car oriented site. And then lastly, the D frontage, the one I mentioned earlier, the Chick-fil-A, none of it's building. And in fact, it's all circulated by a drive-through. But because of the landscape edge and building wall, this is a really good contributor for an area that is more car oriented. Again, you wouldn't want this next to build a block like this, but certainly in areas that are more car oriented, this is an A+ version of a D frontage. Again, to mix the metaphors. So these are all things that where we took the concepts and principles from the current code. And
sorry, Chris,
yes,
can
go
you
ahead.
take a question
Yeah.
from Christine, or would you like to wait?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Can you go back to the Chick-fil-A one?
Yes.
I was wondering if those purple flowers in front, if those count in your rewrite as a shrub or ornamental grass or what. I was noticing trees, ornamental trees, shrubs, and I didn't know how bigger floral xeriscape plants like that, where would those fit in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to be out of my element on that, although I do know from our landscape architect, he usually allows, and I think this is in the table, the shrub to the ornamental grasses are usually at a 3-to-1 comparison. So in other words, one shrub equals 3 of the ornamental grasses. What each of these counts as, I'm not sure of what the species are. I don't know. I think some people on staff might have a little more expertise on that than I do.
Christine, that's a Russian sage that's purple.
Yeah, but does that count as a shrub? Or
Absolutely. Yeah, that's going to be,
okay,
we treat
gotcha.
shrubs as 5 gallons. And so typically a Russian sage would be 5 gallon. It could be 1 gallon, but our current code to be counted as a shrub requires it to be 5 gallon, but we also have a substitution of a certain amount of 1 gallons can equal a 5 gallon. And ornamental grasses, a lot of times the smaller ones, I think those are Carl Forrester, but those are often 1 gallons. But yes, I think we do need, to your point, equivalencies for 1 gallons to 5 gallons. And then this is a pretty xeriscape landscape, actually.
Well, and that's like you said, it's a great example because it's xeriscaped, and it needs to be xeriscaped because it's on 2 very busy streets that are nothing but concrete, so, or asphalt, so.
Yeah, and these buildings here that we selected also kind of reflect that idea of this one particularly, the idea that the transparency doesn't apply to this whole building frontage. It's set way back, but it does apply within the distance to the entrances. And then this one, just a similar deal to a lesser degree, because that building's within 25 feet to the streetscape. I think it's right out about 25 by our rough measurements. So that was the concept for building design. Again, trying to regulate some simple concepts fairly objectively, give some leniency based on the context of where the building is, and then each of these elements in this table has some strategies and techniques below it that can of how we would measure it and what can meet it. And then again, lastly, if someone's not meeting it but has a better design solution, they're certainly eligible to propose it under the administrative adjustment criteria. Any questions on the frontage and building design? I'll move to open space next, if not. Okay, the last major design category under the non-residential was the open space. And again, the current code would have a required landscape area. It's just based on a percentage of the lot for all zoning districts. Again, there's not a building coverage standard, but there is a required landscape area that's, I believe it's around 10% for most of the sites. And so, and then that would essentially mean that you're counting this column here, this third column over, things that are landscape that's usually done for screening or just to soften and create green. But in these mixed use and urban environments, we also want to count some of these spaces as well, as not only count them, but actually require them as part of the provisions for design. So we actually put a provision that we would limit it to the extent your landscape and like, for example, your parking lot landscaping or your landscape that you're doing a buffer. We want that to count towards the required landscape area because you're investing in landscape for a purpose, but we don't want that to be everything. You shouldn't be able to get all your credits by just doing your landscape parking because those aren't the types of spaces we're desiring. So there is a requirement to do some of these building spaces or social spaces. So the idea is that, and then similarly with the building spaces, these are more private and they're not common in public, or they certainly don't relate to the streetscape. So these are also a limited category where you can only meet a certain percentage of your requirement through these types of spaces. But the idea was giving them options to do any of these three categories for the private spaces. And then I mentioned earlier that credits for the public and common. So if someone, this top one is to represent that enhanced streetscape. So if they were on a street where actually the building, the front lot line was here in the middle of the sidewalk, and you had a sidewalk that had an insufficient width, if they expanded it enough to have outdoor seating or a sufficient walkway that's on private property or through easements, that could count to their open space as well. Or if they're in areas that are already well served by larger public open space systems, some of those parks and trails and civic spaces that we talked about under chapter 3, that those could count as well. So that's what that section 16.6.6 is about. And then those would, depending on if it's, so the hardscape areas may not require as much landscape as the pure landscape areas. So that's what I was referring to when I was mentioning that it's not all landscape. And I have some things in chapter 8 that we'll jump to in a minute that will round that idea out. Any questions on that portion?
Colin?
I didn't get a chance to read through it totally. Is there going to be any incorporation of water quality and things like that into this part of the discussion, or does that have to be in a separate part of this? Or
is that water quality from like runoff and stormwater management? Say yes. Okay. I think that would mainly be in chapter 8, which we're about to jump to next. But I'm not entirely sure we'll have your issue covered, so be sure and jump in if we don't. But we dealt with it primarily through the landscape provisions.
Okay. I just know with the, some of these urban spaces, and we can start having some different types of water quality features as opposed to just the landscape side of it. So
yes,
maybe there's just a way of leaving it open, and I can read through the information that you
right.
sent out to also.
Well, and there's a section that that we're pretty open and generic to that I'll refer to in a moment on that. And so if that doesn't answer your question, let us know. Well, this is a sort of a segue. I guess we end chapter 6 with the idea of sustainable site and building guidelines. This came directly from a lot of your all's discussion. So if you recall, we talked about, what's the best strategy for some of these sustainability ideas, require all the way down to just coordinate. And so this section was more of a catch-all for reminding us of all the good things that we need to do that are going to be addressed in more squarely in the building code and wherever the city lands on the updates to the building and energy codes. And then remind ourselves that to the extent doing the right thing under those codes cause a conflict from this code, then we'd want to be, there's another item to give you an administrative adjustment for. So we essentially listed the things that we want to achieve from a sustainability standpoint under these 6 main categories. And then what I did here is I referred to where we might already have something in the code relating to that. So for example, passive heating and cooling. We know we have standards with regard to building placement, the build to lines, and we know we have landscape requirements. So we would hope those are enabling people to do passive heating and cooling, but to the extent they aren't, we would want to accept an exception to either where you placed your landscape or how you oriented and placed your building if it handled some of those elements. Similarly, with more green building, some of the building code issues, if there's anything creating conflicts with that, we would want to address that, but this code isn't specifically requiring a certain rating. Our view is that's the job of the building code in that separate policy discussion. So a similar thought process goes through all of these. I think urban heat island is one where maybe there's a lot of different balances and competing interests. Site scale renewable energy probably deserves a little bit of attention because the city is had a third party do an audit of the code, and their assessment was the code needed some improvements because it's silent to a lot of these things. Our assessment was it's silent to them because it's so ubiquitous and allowed as an accessory use that everyone's doing it, and we just treat it like we would any accessory structure or use, and it gets all the exceptions that you would for, you know, height, equipment in the setbacks, those types of things. So we're monitoring that to make sure that the solar particularly is clearly permitted and clearly permitted in the easiest way possible. So we think we're on the right track with that from looking at the audit, but we're working through that with staff. There's another example of, to the extent we can relieve other standards that better support site scale renewable energy, we want the code to be ready to do that.
Christine, oh, sorry, Christine has a question. I didn't know if you were done. Sorry, Chris.
Nope. Yeah, I think it's fine.
Thanks. On the renewable energy bullet point, one idea I had that I was wondering if we could look at is for commercial buildings that have sloped roofs, not flat, if they could be oriented towards the south or the west to maximize the solar potential, because that's where we really need the solar. And that seemed more of a development code thing than a building code thing.
Yeah, and I think we can probably direct it in any way. I think the question there would be, we certainly don't think there's anything in the code that would prohibit that. But if a build to line was, you know, forcing them to orient their building a certain way so that the slope couldn't be properly allocated, then yes, by all means, allow that to be an administrative adjustment to promote this principle. If the question is, should we then require all sloped roofs to have that orientation, I'd leave that up to the committee and staff to give us direction on that, because currently right now we think it's open to doing that, and we would encourage it and promote it. And if we have any standards that worked against that, we would relieve them, but we don't specifically require it.
Okay, then on that note, my preference would be to discuss if we could require it for sloped roofs. And short of that, if we could at least put explicit wording to encourage it, rather than just say, if it happens to happen, then we'll accept it. But something a little more proactive on that front.
Any other thoughts on that idea, or
I was gonna
Sorry, Colin.
change subject. I can see where Christine's going with that, and I think I'd be supportive of that, but I was gonna say, is there any way that we can include in these sustainable sites and building guidelines also a mention of the water quality side of things? Also, I noticed that is kind of the guidelines in 1667B, you know, that we note all of these items here, I think, or just about all of them, but if we could somehow include enhancing water quality, I think that would be good.
yes,
the stormwater quality. Thank you.
And then Kate?
I was actually going to mention something similar under water efficiency, that stormwater quality or green infrastructure type things would be part of water efficiency.
Okay. And Bernie?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention something on the requirement for the roof slope. I understand the intent there, but I think that's a slippery slope. We have to remember that there's a lot of other things that come into the way in which a building is designed other than providing a platform for solar panels. So, maybe having a roof that slopes to allow sunlight in is maybe more important for the occupants than having the ability to put solar panels at the right access point. Also, I think with a lot of our urban buildings having flat roofs, I think there's different ways of coordinating that in there and actually potentially hiding the solar panels. So they become a little bit more efficient put on, and it's part of the design process if they so choose to do that. So I would highly recommend against trying to determine which way roof slopes go.
Michelle?
Yeah, I would agree with what Bernie just said. And I think we also need to remember that we are taking on this whole project with an eye to the future, and we don't know what solar panels are going to look like down the road. And so I just don't want to get too specific on all this stuff, so that we have to let's look to the future and understand that we may not know everything. So some flexibility might be a better idea.
Yeah, and on one of the interesting notes on the solar audit was there was a critique that because the code was silent to it, it wasn't clear if rooftop solar panels got the same exception that other rooftop equipment did in terms of height limits. And we would say yes, and if not, we'll make it clear in this code update. And to the second part on the screening, the solar audit said, well, anything that requires screening of it is negative because that's going to cost more, and that will be a detriment to solar. And I'm not so sure we agree with that from the consultant standpoint, because you're screening all rooftop equipment anyway, and it's not necessarily an onerous thing. However, and this goes to the point of the sloped roof issue as well, if the best location for the solar panel meant that it couldn't be screened, this code would certainly grant an administrative adjustment for that based on this section. So I think that's the place, I think that's how we want to end up and address some of those things in the audit, as well as addressing some of the comments and concerns we're hearing from you all as well. I'll jump into chapter 8 real quickly. And this does, some of the water quality issues come in here, although we certainly need to add it back into that sustainable sites element. Essentially the biggest change, as I mentioned, was converting from the required landscape area to then breaking the landscape requirements down by your site elements. Currently, the required landscape area is just a flat percentage of the site, whereas the site elements approach will allow us to tailor what your landscape requirement is to what you have going on. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. But our thought process on that is that then we're sure that we're getting landscape that is that's more targeted towards meeting certain design objectives. In other words, we're putting it in not just to count landscape and get a certain percentage. We want it to meet specific design and performance goals. So breaking it into the site elements, we think does that perhaps a little bit better, but we think we will end up at roughly about the same plant requirements as a typical site, depending on what you have and don't have going on. The other major change was not a major change, I think it's a subtle change, is we changed your buffer standards. By our assessment, there's 3 different buffer standards, but none of them were that different than the other. They almost all ended up at the same plant count. So we created 3 different types based on the width and density of plants. and then created 3 different scenarios for when you'd use each type. We improved the Xeric guidance. It's nothing, it's fairly simple things. And I think it's actually based off of the Dr. Cog WaterWise guidance. But we did up in the table, there's a non-living allowance that says only up to 30% can be non-living, and we bumped that to 50 in the base table. And then the Xeric guidelines actually become, because they're guidelines and we think almost all landscapes can meet them, we did establish them as a baseline for all landscapes should be water wise in that regard. We're open to suggestions or critiques on that because we certainly don't want to push too far on that. But I think the way the guidelines read, they're just good, helpful advice on how to do landscape in arid climates, and it's certainly they can be very attractive as well under those kind of criteria. And then the last section, we reorganized and simplified the fence standards with fence and walls with, we think, no substantive changes, but just trying to make them a little more simple.
Chris,
So
we have
Kate-
a question from Kate.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kate has a question and then Brooke.
Maybe I should hold this if we're going to go into it more in detail, but I just had a comment on the Xeric requirements or suggestions.
Yes, go ahead.
And-
That's fine. I didn't have a specific slide on that, so this is a good time.
City of Aurora just recently updated their requirements to have a maximum of 500 square feet of sod surface. So I didn't know if that was something we would want to consider. If Aurora can do it, we can do it. And then from there, the rest would need to be Xeric or artificial turf or other kinds of landscaping. So something.
Brooke? Brooke, you're on mute.
Oh,
You're still on mute.
There you go.
okay. Chris, if you could go back to the last slide on the, yeah, so that is correct. Currently, you can only have, currently you need 70% of the required landscape area to be living, and the rest of the 30% of your landscape can be non-living. And so I think the living is important, but that we have a lot of living landscape in the city, and in my opinion, living landscape, replenishes the air, evapotranspirates, moisture. So I think living is important. I think perhaps we can lower, not lower necessarily the living, or this is my suggestion, from 50% down to, or 70% down to 50%, but perhaps say that 70% needs to be living, but 20% of that has to be xeriscape, meaning xeric plantings, not necessarily rock or just mulch, but that perhaps it's still 70% living, with a portion of that living being, bona fide xeric plantings. And that can be determined by certain plant lists, and it's just something to throw out there to keep the living percentage high, but also raise the standards for what is xeric and what is not. And perhaps that comes in conjunction with, limiting the amount of bluegrass.
Yeah,
And
those are
co-
both good suggestions. If I can just comment real quickly on that, because
course.
one of the things that we may find on trying to address both of those ideas is because we've broken it into these elements, these are all assuming that these are all going to be living requirements, because these are plant requirements in all of these site elements. So when we got to the other, what's the rest of the unbuilt site, that's where we came up with that. That's essentially the leftover of your required landscape area. So perhaps because we're counting some of those civic spaces that I mentioned that it might be hardscape but have like a landscape area, but they need to be landscaped according to this section. Maybe that addresses that, and this should go back down. Or perhaps this is the area where we also limit that irrigated turf grass shouldn't exceed certain amounts in this area. And we've done codes and we're familiar with that requirement. It's just a matter of finding what's the right fit for you all.
Colin?
And I'm glad to see that you have permeable surfaces in there. I think there is a bit of a challenge with the artificial turf that I don't think we fully understand yet. How obviously there's benefits to the fact that it doesn't require water, but it's not a complete, it's not a permeable surface, so water just runs right off of it, and you can end up with problems there, as well as just some of the processing and things that happen. So I don't see that anywhere in here. I think it was on the previous page, or I think maybe you had mentioned it, but I think not pushing artificial turf, I think would be a benefit. If it is used in some places, I think that's okay, but as long as we're calling for permeable areas for those places, I think that would be better.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and I think I didn't have a slide as clearly as I wanted on your other point of the stormwater, but one of the sections to pay attention to in the plant specifications, in other words, the first couple sections are just trying to get you to what's your number, what do you need on the site, and then you have the flexibility to kind of design the site to meet all of those design objectives. But when we get to the plant specifications, okay, that gets to the question earlier on what's a shrub versus perennial grass or ornamental grass. So those things we're trying, I think the city, there's a current reference in the current code to the Inglewood Landscape Manual. And so we just want to make sure that that's the best resource where that has all the preferred species and how they're organized and coordinated, how they're planted. We believe those types of things should be outside of the development code. That's actually one of the most essential parts of this. Our landscape architect always reminds us you can require whatever you want, but it's only going to live if it's planted correctly. So that's a big, huge part of it. But we think like referring to that in the plant specifications is important. This is also where we have what we think is at least a first broach to that water quality issue, and we will need to round it out. But it's the idea that stormwater, the stormwater requirements for each site, from our understanding with the technical committee, they're going to be required regardless of how big or how little you build. The landscape requirements aren't guaranteeing that you meet your stormwater requirements. That's outside of this code, and every site will have to meet it. What we want to do is to make sure that things meeting that stormwater requirement with regard to quantity and quality can contribute to it through landscape standards. So in that specifications, we have a provision that says your stormwater requirements should be landscaped according to this code, and that's how we're trying to integrate the water quantity and quality part with the site design and landscape. I don't know that we have that 100% buttoned up between how it's currently working, and I don't know that we have your specific issues on water quality and what might be going on now addressed, but that would at least be the place to expand on it in the code, that subsection.
Chris, you're very correct on the water quality aspect of all this, and public works and engineering does sort of trump our code in a good way in terms of water quality. We're always happy to hear them say, well, you're going to need some water quality, and so you need to propose something, and they often suggest our landscaping, and that just helps emphasize the need for landscape. So I think that's a great approach on that. And then in terms of our landscape manual, I would not necessarily use that as our guidepost for some of what you're talking about with our species and so forth. It's it has its place, but it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have a xeriscape bent.
Okay. Oh, shoot. I was hoping. In that case, we might want to refer to other regional resources. I know
Yes.
CSU Extension has a really good one.
Correct.
So we could, okay, good. I'll go into a little bit more about why we thought this breaking it into site elements might work better. This block is sort of meant to represent every possible scenario you could run into in a non-residential setting. And so you can see that if you were on, let's say you were on one of these and buildings here, that's a street front building, and you built the whole site, you really wouldn't have a landscape requirement other than the streetscape. So your streetscape could be everything you need. To the extent you add parking to it, well, then you're going to have a parking landscape requirement. To the extent you have a building that's set back, you might have a frontage buffer requirement or a foundation area landscape requirement for your building. And then to the extent you have anything on your site that's requiring to be buffered and screened per our performance criteria, then you're going to have that requirement. So it was a way in our mind to make the landscape standards a little more context-based and a little more performance-based by still having the same or similar plant objectives, rather than just saying that every site needs at least 10% required landscape or whatever the percentage might be. So that's at least the logic to it. It's probably not perfect, but again, that's why we wanted to have you take advantage of the administrative adjustments criteria and give something that's flexible but very guided towards some specific outcomes and goals. Rounding, I put this slide in again because again, that idea of that some of these spaces that are not landscaped are going to have landscape components with them. So just because you have a more of a hardscape plaza doesn't mean it doesn't have landscape elements in it. Just because your building frontage down this lower left corner is set back doesn't mean it's all landscape. Part of it could be seating and patio, part of it could be landscape. So there's that combination of hardscape and landscape with some of these spaces. And so that's sort of the idea behind chapter 8. And again, these are the three main sections. So this table is setting the sort of the default, that objective standard that you can count, measure, get to your number. And in all of these, you go through this process of looking at the design objectives, looking at what the requirement is, looking at the design techniques and options. And then if you can't meet the standard, the administrative adjustment process is available. And so that works with both the landscape requirements, the buffer and screening, and the plant specifications. I'm going to hit chapter 10 real quick, and then unfortunately I'm a little behind my exit time and I'm going to have to jump off, but I do want the conversation to continue because I think it's been great so far, and Matt will be prepared to take notes if that's all right with you all. Chapter 10 is essentially the floodplain standards. We aren't floodplain experts. We can help organize the code and make it more simple. We can also listen to any concerns that are being, that the current standards are creating. And we can look for ways to make the floodplain standards work with all the other things we're doing. So that's what we're trying to do right now. We don't anticipate any substantive changes to that section. Public Works is reviewing it for things that they think need to be cleaned up and take the opportunity in this effort. But essentially what we plan on doing is just sort of reorganizing the current floodplain standards to meet and match this format, the new revised format of the code, and maybe simplify some of the wording here and there when we can to make it work better. But unless you all or have heard from others that there's things that are wrong with that, that's what we plan on doing. I think there's a lot of opportunities to integrate some of these things into more civic design assets of the community, like whether it's streetscape or whether it's open spaces. We want to make that happen to any extent we can. And so that's what we're looking for with regard to chapter 10.
Colin?
I did have one item that I noted on here, and I thought we had changed it recently where we, instead of saying the specific study that was done, changed it to the latest version of whatever FAD study or whatever that was completed for the city. I was looking online at the Muni code, and it looks like we still show, you know, the boundaries of West Harvard Gulch and Harvard Gulch repaired and these specific studies. And I thought that we had changed that to more of a general, whatever the latest version is, shall be what we regulate to. So if we can do that, I think that would be helpful if we haven't already, or maybe I'm just looking at an older version.
I think Public Works, as Chris mentioned, is reviewing that. And I think they will be sensitive to that. There's, you know, or latest amendment type of language, latest revision, latest version. Obviously, the FEMA maps are always changing. And there's other studies that are done even when the FEMA maps don't change. So I think, if anything, that's a great comment to make sure that we're going off of the latest language. I will say that, oh gosh, I think it was 2013 or so that the Colorado Water Conservation Board was very prescriptive in the language that they wanted Colorado municipalities to adopt, and to a point of we made changes to our code and had to have them reviewed by Colorado Water Conservation Board, and so they've got some very standardized language, which I actually think is a good thing.
No, and obviously, if there's precedent that we have to follow because of their requirements, obviously we'll need to do that. But I think it would be good to make it as general as possible so we can, you know, regulate to that latest information as it gets updated, and we don't get stuck regulating to something old.
All right, so Chris, I'm going to send you off on your way because I do believe it is your anniversary and we need to get you off this meeting and over to your family event. So thank you for your presentation, and I will do my best to take good notes on the questions that come up from here on out.
It was yesterday. I'm not that terrible of a husband, but we have a concert to go to. So thanks, everyone.
Happy anniversary.
Yes,
you.
enjoy.
Enjoy
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Bye.
It's a late night.
It is. So, all right. So just want to make sure that there are no additional questions. Again, I am not as well versed as Chris is in the backwards and forwards of many of these items, but we'll go ahead and make sure that we're capturing the questions in the notes and that we can deal with that. So Christine, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. I had one other thing to see if it would be possible in chapter 6 in the intent to add a bullet point for sustainability there.
Yes, suggestion to add a bullet point in the intent. For sustainability, did you have anything in particular that you were thinking related to that, or just a general kind of blanket coverage?
Yeah, general.
Okay.
Yeah, back in chapter 6 about the commercial building design, it had lots of really good overall goals, and I think another overall goal for sustainability would fit very nicely in that list.
Very good. All right. Any other comments or questions, concepts that folks want to go back to? I do have the presentation shared, so we can backtrack on slides if you would like. All right, so just moving forward, want to give you a preview of where we're headed next. So our next steering committee meeting would be November 15th with housing and neighborhood design being covered. We're also looking at chatting with John and the rest of the city staff about the possibility of integrating some of the affordable housing components into that discussion as well. And so I just need to make sure that the two efforts are tracking correctly before we make that final call as to how those issues will be formally rolled out with you, but we should know that here within the next week or so as far as the progress on those items go. Kate, I see a hand up.
Thanks, Matt. Sorry, I had a couple things I wanted to mention. I just wasn't sure if it was time or not. So can I still add a few comments?
Yes, absolutely.
This might have been covered in some of my comments from last time, but I think one of the things that would be great to be able to explore, especially for parking lot landscape, is looking at a % shade coverage, maybe more so than the tree per number of spaces. Unless, and Brooke, you or others might have good examples of whether trees can survive, because the hotter it is, the less likely they're going to survive. So the spacing might look nice, but if it's not viable, then it doesn't really make sense to put it in the code like that. So other communities have recently, I think Portland and a few other places have put in a % coverage as the goal rather than spacing. And another thing I didn't know if you had considered for some of the plan, but thinking about some of the best practices from crime prevention through environmental design, and whether, you know, different plants or things that are added in. They also have like the list of plants and things that are less likely for like people to hide in, or how they're placed in relationship to the building, things like that.
Yes, I would anticipate that might be a design objective or something referenced in that type of a section that would say, you know, looking to balance the safety elements related to the planting materials and location.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kate. Yeah, crime prevention through environmental design. You know, you don't want to create hiding places and hedges for people to jump out of. And I'm not familiar with the percentage of shade, but I think that's very interesting. I'm guessing it's based on species. But yeah, if you have anything you could forward that you saw, or we could look at Portland, but I've never heard of that. That sounds interesting.
Michelle?
Well, I have lived both in Portland and obviously here. And I will tell you that the climate is radically different, and it's much easier to grow trees and grow everything faster in Portland. But I think Kate's point is a very good one. We should try to maximize shade, because those parking lots are just heat islands. But that said, I'm sorry, what? Oh, I heard something in the background.
I don't think that was intentional, Michelle. Keep going.
Okay. But unfortunately here in Colorado, especially with a newer development, it's impossible to plant trees that really offer any shade, unfortunately. It's just, you can't transplant a tree that big and expect to keep it alive. So it's a great goal. And I think we need to strive for it, but I don't know how specific we need to put it in the code.
Kate?
I was just gonna say, the example's actually from Phoenix. So I'll share that one.
And Colin?
And I hear what you're saying, Michelle, and I think there's a practical side of it. There are ways though to grow trees and transplant them. I know like the 16th Street Mall is doing that, where they're growing pretty huge trees to basically be able to put in, you know, at a time where they'll be actually substantive as opposed to just the little twigs that tend to go in. So I don't know that it needs to be in here specifically. I think the goal of having the coverage, I think, would be great, but you know, if we can push towards that, I think that would be a benefit to everybody.
And Colin, you know, I work for a tree company too, right?
Christine, go ahead.
I didn't know that.
I really like this idea, Michelle. Good to hear. I like Colin's approach of exploring ideas to get bigger trees, but even if that were not possible, it seems like you could plan for there to be a certain amount of shade in a certain number of years in the future. We know that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. So with that in mind, I wouldn't let the fact that the trees aren't huge to start with discourage us from promoting putting them in now.
Brooke?
Christine's right. You would do it at what the plant would be at maturity. And there's always going to be a range there, but certainly some trees provide more shade than others at maturity. And that's how you would do it. You wouldn't want to be spading trees or putting in huge trees. Not only is impractical and uneconomical, but it also planting smaller trees is actually, in terms of caliper, better in terms of viability, and they go through a lot less shock when they're planted. So yeah, I think having some kind of tying something to shade is interesting, but yeah, you wouldn't see those results for some time, but that's okay.
Brenda?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not very experienced in urban planning, nor am I going to pretend I know anything about it. But I guess my question regarding all of this is how to prevent, as we think about the city center and any new development that might be happening in that area, how do we prevent anything from happening again where we have these large expanses of unused parking space? You know, say that whole area in front of the Big Lots, or the whole area in front of between the Office Depot and the hardware store. We've talked a lot how to make it surround the parking lots. We really haven't talked about how much parking does each business, how much are they allowed to take up? Is there any limit to that so that we don't even have these large unused spaces? Or or is that answered by the marketplace?
I would say it's a little bit of both. The market is definitely going to drive towards less expansive parking and more driven by actual use numbers. Additionally, the code is proposing to reduce the amount of required parking to minimize that amount. Obviously, previous standards were either left open to individual businesses who provided as much as they possibly could under the philosophy that more is better. Certainly with higher land costs, that's going to naturally limit the amount of parking that's provided. And additionally, the number of required parking spaces will be addressed in a different section of code as well.
Thank you.
And Brenda, I don't know if you were here for the last meeting, but I think Chris touched on it a little bit. And the parking numbers are in the draft currently. They're not all concrete as to what the recommendation is yet. They're still kind of filtering through. But one of the items that he talked about was using things called soft maximums, that if they get to a certain threshold of our requirement, that you could require them to do additional things to try to mitigate that parking. One of those items generally is landscaping. So that was another part of that.
Thanks. Yes, I was here, but I didn't pick up on that. Thank you.
All right, any other questions or comments? All right, and as we're working through the schedule, it looks like either the 22nd or the 29th, we will be working through the other provisions. Again, just coordinating with staff on when the actual meeting would take place due to the holidays. And that would include some of those additional items, including signs, telecom, and historic preservation. The other important thing to keep in mind is that we will be working through similar sessions like these to introduce these city council to chapters. And so those will start gearing up in early November and really starting to bring this code to that body for additional discussion. But it's been really positive for us to be able to go through the steering committee with this level of detail to make sure we're on the right track so that we do have a solid series of recommendations for city council to begin reviewing. So with that, I do believe we are at the end of the presentation. Brooke or Brian, do you have anything additional to add?
No, I just want to verify that we have the November 15th, the dates right on here for our next meetings.
Nancy, I know that Chris did have some dates that I had different, so let's double check that November date.
I thought it was November 8th, but that would be the regular meeting night, I believe. Yeah, that's the second or the first meeting after city council. That would be the regular night, but it's whatever the committee wants to do.
So Brian, is there a need to shift that date, or is that the correct night for the meeting for housing and neighborhood design?
I think the 8th is the correct night, but can we double check? And if we need to reach back out tomorrow to make sure that we have the correct night, is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Nancy, is that okay with you? I see Michelle's hand up. Michelle, is that okay with you?
Well, I think the last time we discussed this, or one of the times we discussed this, I pointed out that the 8th is election night and there's many people who, well, there may or may not volunteer at the polls and things like that. And it may not be the best night to have a meeting, so.
I was checking Inglewood and Gates, but yeah, we can certainly get that figured out tomorrow.
Okay.
Very good. Nancy, Brian, we will circle back with you tomorrow on that topic and get a notice out to the committee, just confirming the specific night for the next meeting. All right, Michelle, do you have something new?
No, I'm sorry, I forgot to lower my hand, sorry.
No worries, no worries. Well, with that, just want to thank you all for your time this evening. Really great feedback. I've got quite a few notes from the discussion to be able to share with the team and with Chris as we button these chapters up. And with that, thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you all.